Elara's hands trembled as she filled her water skin from the rushing river. Winter approached with cruel inevitability, and 3 months of solitude in these woods hadn't eased her fear of the coming cold. Darkness would fall soon, and she still needed kindling. Then she heard it, a faint, frightened whimper cutting through the water's roar. She squinted through the fading light. There, on a fallen log snagged mid-river, a tiny shape huddled against the current. A wolf cub, no larger than bread loaf, its soaked fur clinging to its small body. As she watched, it slipped on the slick bark, nearly tumbling into the churning water below. "Where's your mother?" Elara whispered, scanning the opposite shore. "Nothing." The sensible choice was obvious. Leave, return to shelter. She barely had enough food for herself. Winter would be merciless without another mouth to feed. Yet she remained frozen, watching the cub's frightened eyes meet hers. "Foolish girl," she muttered, already untying her boots. The river's icy water stole her breath. Fed by mountain snowmelt, it numbed her feet instantly as she waded deeper. Her skirt grew heavy, fighting every step. The current strengthened as she reached the middle, pulling at her waist like hungry hands. The log shifted. The cub whimpered louder. "Almost there," Elara gasped. 3 more steps. 2. Her fingers found rough bark, then gripped the log's edge. The cub cowered, showing tiny teeth. "I won't hurt you," she whispered. "Let me help." Something in her voice made the creature still. Its body felt shockingly light as she lifted it, cradling the bundle of wet fur against her chest. The return journey felt endless, the current stronger, her legs weak with cold. When her foot finally touched shore, relief flooded through her, quickly followed by realization. The rain now fell in earnest. Elara gathered her belongings with one arm, keeping the cub secure with the other. Blood smeared her skin where its paw had been cut. "You're safe," she murmured, wrapping her cloak around them both. "I have a fire waiting. Not much food, but enough to share." The cub nestled closer, seeking her warmth. For the first time in months, the weight of another living creature against her heart made her isolation feel less absolute. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating her path. In that brief flash, the forest seemed to stir, shadows moving in ways wind couldn't explain. Elara quickened her pace, unaware that her simple act of mercy had been witnessed by eyes hidden among the ancient trees. Chapter 1. Morning light filtered through the cabin's single window. Elara stirred the embers in the hearth, coaxing the dying fire back to life. The wolf cub lay curled on her only blanket, watching her with strange amber eyes. "You're looking better," she murmured, reaching for a pouch on the wall. Inside was the last of her dried venison, precious food she'd been saving. She hesitated, then broke off a small piece. "I suppose we both need our strength." The cub's nose twitched. It rose shakily, testing its injured paw before limping toward her outstretched hand. The cabin was hardly more than 4 walls and a roof, a hunter's shelter long abandoned before she'd found it. She'd swept away years of dust, patched the leaking roof with branches and moss, made it barely habitable. Herbs hung from the rafters. A pile of kindling stood in one corner, a wash basin in another. Her few possessions sat neatly on a crude shelf. No silk sheets, no silver hairbrush, no ladies' maids to dress her each morning. No father arranging her marriage to a king thrice widowed under suspicious circumstances. The cub took the meat with surprising gentleness. "You're the first guest I've entertained," Elara said, breaking another piece. "I should warn you, my hospitality isn't what it once was." She was reaching for the pot when she noticed the change. The constant background murmur of the forest, birds calling, leaves rustling, the distant river, had stopped. An unnatural silence pressed against the walls. The cub froze, meat forgotten, its ears pricked forward. "What is it?" Elara whispered. The cub whined, limping toward the door, then looked back at her expectantly. Her heart quickened. 3 months she'd remained hidden. 3 months of looking over her shoulder. Had the king's men finally found her? The cub scratched at the door, whimpering urgently. Elara's hands trembled as she reached for the iron poker by the fire. She moved to the door, pressing her ear against the rough wood. Nothing, not even wind. Her fingers hesitated on the latch. Every instinct screamed to bar the door, to hide. But she couldn't bear not knowing. Slowly, she pulled the door open a crack. A gasp escaped her lips. Wolves, dozens of them, stood in perfect stillness, forming a wide circle around her cabin. Their fur ranged from silver gray to tawny to deep brown. But their eyes were all the same unnatural amber as the cub's, reflecting the morning light like polished coins. The cub struggled against her legs, trying to push through the opening. "No," she whispered, but it squeezed past before she could catch it. The wolves watched motionless as the cub limped into the clearing. Then, like a sea parting, they shifted, creating a path through their midst. From the trees stepped a wolf unlike any Elara had ever imagined. Massive, shoulders reaching higher than her waist, with fur as black as midnight. It moved with liquid grace, power contained in every step. This was no ordinary wolf. It was something from legend. The great wolf's gaze locked with hers, and Elara forgot to breathe. Those eyes held more than animal intelligence. There was knowledge there, ancient and feral, and somehow human. The cub yipped. A smaller gray wolf stepped forward from the pack, nuzzling the cub with obvious relief. Its mother, Elara realized. The black wolf lowered its massive head, a bow, unmistakably deliberate. Then, as if responding to an unheard command, every wolf in the clearing threw back its head and howled. The sound washed over Elara like a physical force, primal and haunting. It vibrated in her chest, raising the hair on her arms. This was gratitude. When the last howl faded, the black wolf turned and disappeared into the trees. The other wolves remained, still forming their perfect circle, still watching. Moments later, the black wolf returned, dragging the carcass of a young deer. With deliberate steps, it brought the offering to her doorway and dropped it at her feet. Then it stepped back, those piercing eyes never leaving her face. Elara stared at the deer, a gift that would feed her for weeks. The wolf waited, as if expecting a response. Cautiously, she reached toward the carcass. The wolf watched her movements, then did something impossible. It rose onto its hind legs. Elara stumbled back, clutching the doorframe. The wolf's form rippled like heat waves above summer stones. Fur receded, limbs elongated, spine straightened, bones shifted beneath skin with audible cracks. Where the wolf had stood, a man now rose to his full height. Tall, taller than any man she'd ever seen, with powerful shoulders and arms corded with muscle. His skin was bronzed, marked with old scars. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, wild and untamed. Around his neck hung a thin chain with something that caught the light. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. The same eyes that had stared at her from the wolf's face. Human in shape now, but still burning with that feral intelligence. The man who had been a wolf took a step toward her, head tilted in curiosity. Elara's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The world tilted sideways. Darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was his expression. Not threatening, not angry, but wondering, as if she were the magical creature, not him. Chapter 2. Elara awoke with a jolt, her cheek pressed against the rough wooden floor. The blanket where the wolf cub had rested lay empty. "A dream," she whispered, pressing fingers to her temples. It was just a dream. Men didn't transform from wolves. Such things belonged in fairy tales, not the waking world. Yet something nagged at her, a memory too vivid to be conjured by sleep. Those eyes burning with intelligence. the naked man standing where the wolf had been. Elara rose unsteadily and moved to the door. Her hand hesitated on the latch. What if he was still there, waiting? She drew a steadying breath and pushed the door open. The morning air struck her face, crisp with autumn's bite. And there, on the ground before her cabin, lay the evidence she couldn't deny. A deer carcass, its neck bearing the unmistakable puncture marks of massive fangs. Blood had soaked into the earth beneath it, still fresh enough to glisten. Her knees weakened. Not a dream, then. Somewhere in these woods lived a creature of impossibility, a man who became a wolf. And he had brought her this offering like a courtier might bring flowers. Only his tribute was paid in flesh and blood. But why? What did he want from her? Elara approached the deer cautiously, glancing repeatedly at the tree line. The forest stood silent, revealing nothing. But she couldn't shake the sensation that eyes watched her from the shadows. His eyes. The deer was a young doe, plump with summer feeding, enough meat to last well into winter if properly preserved. A gift that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. She dragged it toward the old woodshed behind the cabin, the weight requiring her full strength. Twice she paused, certain she'd glimpsed movement among the trees, but saw nothing when she looked directly. Still, the sensation of being observed never faded. At her workbench, her hands moved automatically, cutting away the hide with practiced motions her father had insisted she learn. "No wonder you were so eager to sell me to a king with bloody hands," she muttered, slicing methodically. "You never saw me as more than meat yourself." The work was messy but familiar. She hung strips to smoke over a small fire, packed others in the precious salt she'd discovered in the cabin's root cellar. By midday, her arms ached and blood stained her sleeves, but satisfaction warmed her chest. She would survive the winter now, regardless of what price the wolfman might eventually demand. As she washed blood from her hands in a basin, the sensation intensified, a prickling awareness between her shoulder blades. Not just watching now, but closer. She turned sharply, water dripping from her fingertips. The forest's edge revealed nothing. Yet the feeling remained so powerful she could almost taste it. The focused attention of a hunter measuring her every movement. "Is someone there?" she called, immediately regretting the words. If the king's men were watching, she'd just revealed herself. If it was the wolf? Well, what did one say to a wolf who walked as a man? Silence answered her, but not emptiness. A flash of movement caught her eye. There, between two ancient oaks, stood the black wolf. His eyes, golden as harvest moons, watched her with an intensity that felt almost like physical touch. Elara's heart thundered. Those jaws could crush her throat before she took a single step in flight. Yet something deeper than fear kept her rooted. Curiosity. Wonder. Slowly, feeling foolish even as she did it, Elara raised her hand in greeting. The wolf made no response to the human gesture. His gaze remained fixed, traveling from her face down the length of her body and back again, measuring her in some way she couldn't comprehend, or perhaps in a way she understood all too well. For a long moment they stood locked in silent acknowledgement, woman and wolf, prey and predator, each wary, each fascinated. Then, with fluid grace, he turned and loped away between the trees. Elara released the breath she'd been holding, her empty hand still raised in the air. Her skin felt flushed, her pulse racing as if she'd run for miles. She gathered her fallen bundle of wood with trembling fingers, suddenly aware of a feeling she couldn't name, as if something momentous had nearly happened, but had slipped away at the last moment. Something that would return as inevitably as the tide. Chapter 3. Elara stood at her cabin doorway, surveying the white landscape with worried eyes. Winter had arrived, and her herbs were depleted, the yarrow and willow bark nearly gone. She'd need to venture deeper into the forest today, to a sheltered ravine where evergreen herbs might still survive beneath the snow. Wrapping her cloak tightly and tucking a small digging tool into her belt, she set out. The journey was arduous, each step sinking deep into fresh powder. By midday, she'd reached the ravine, a steep-sided gully where windswept rock kept the snow shallow. Elara knelt, scraping away snow with gloved hands. Her fingers worked quickly, filling her small pouch with precious findings. So absorbed was she that the voices reached her too late. "Tracks lead this way. Someone's been through here recently." Elara froze, her breath catching. Men's voices, growing closer. She scrambled behind a fallen log, pressing herself against cold bark. Through gaps in the deadwood, she saw them. 3 men in the unmistakable crimson and gold of King Sohan's royal guard. Her heart hammered against her ribs. 3 months hiding, and still he hunted her. "Sir, look there." One guard pointed toward her abandoned digging spot. "Someone was just here." The leader approached, kneeling to examine the freshly disturbed earth. His gloved hand reached out, lifting her forgotten herb pouch. "Still warm," he said. "The quarry is close." Elara pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a whimper. They were tracking her specifically, not random patrols, but men sent to bring her back. The 3rd guard spotted her tracks in the snow. "This way," he called, following the depressions that led directly to her hiding place. No choice. Elara burst from concealment, startling the men. She bolted through the trees, snow hampering each desperate stride. "There! It's her! Lady Elara!" The guards crashed through the forest behind her, gaining with each step. She couldn't lead them to her cabin. It was all she had. The river, if she could reach it, cross where the ice was thick enough, perhaps she could lose them. Elara veered sharply, heading toward the sound of rushing water. Just a few more steps. Her ankle twisted violently as her foot plunged through hidden snow into a rabbit hole. White-hot pain shot up her leg as she fell, and before she could rise, heavy hands seized her arms, dragging her upright. "Lady Elara of House Mercer," a guard intoned formally. "By order of His Majesty King Sohan, you are commanded to return to the palace and fulfill your marriage vows." "No!" Panic clawed at her throat. "He'll kill me like the others. You know he will." The guards exchanged uncomfortable glances, but their grip didn't loosen. "We have our orders, my lady," the leader said. "The king wants his bride returned unharmed." "For how long?" Elara demanded, struggling against their hold. "Until I'm with child? Until I've served my purpose? Have mercy." "Just following orders," the 2nd guard muttered. They began to drag her back toward the forest. Her injured ankle screamed in protest, tears of pain and desperation freezing on her cheeks. A low, rumbling growl stopped them all. There, on the riverbank, stood the massive black wolf. Snow melted around his paws from the heat of his body. His teeth gleamed, bared in a snarl that promised death. "Wolf!" the leader shouted, releasing Elara to draw his sword. "Stand back!" The beast launched forward with impossible speed, a blur of midnight fur and terrible purpose. The guard's sword swung, but the wolf was already past his defenses, jaws closing around the man's arm with a sickening crunch of bone. The other men released Elara, drawing their weapons, but the wolf was a whirlwind of savage movement. Too fast, too strong, too precise in his attacks. One guard fled, disappearing into the trees with a cry of terror. The leader staggered back, his broken arm hanging useless. "Demon!" he gasped, stumbling away. "We will return with silver and fire." Then they were gone, leaving only trampled snow and drops of blood behind. The wolf stood panting in the sudden silence, steam rising from his muzzle. Blood stained his jaws, dripping onto the pristine snow beneath him. Slowly, he turned toward Elara, those golden eyes finding hers. No longer was there any confusion about what this creature was. Not merely animal, not merely predator, but something ancient and terrifying in its perfect violence. Elara could not run, could not fight, could only watch as death or salvation approached. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking with fear. "Don't eat me." The air around the wolf rippled like heat above summer stones. Fur receded, limbs elongated, and where the beast had stood, the man now rose, naked and magnificent against the white landscape. Elara averted her eyes instinctively, then found them drawn back as if pulled by some invisible force. In daylight, she could see him clearly, the powerful muscles shifting beneath his skin, the strange pendant hanging from the chain around his neck. He approached, each step measured, deliberate, like a hunter stalking prey that had nowhere to run. "Thank you," Elara murmured, "for saving me." He tilted his head, studying her. A smear of the guard's blood still marked his lower lip. "Can you understand me?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. No response came from his lips, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you have a name?" She tried again. He knelt before her in the snow, seemingly unbothered by the cold against his bare skin. His gaze traveled from her face down to her ankle, then back up again in a slow appraisal that left her skin tingling beneath her wet clothes. He reached out one hand, hesitating just before touching her injured ankle. His fingers were stained with blood, yet surprisingly elegant. A killer's hands, capable of both violence and perhaps gentleness. "It's not broken," she told him, unsure if he understood. "Just twisted. I can—" Before she could finish, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his bare chest. Elara gasped, her hands instinctively flying to his shoulders for balance. Her fingers met warm skin stretched over hard muscle, and she jerked them back as if burned, only to find nowhere else to place them. "Wait," she protested weakly. "I can walk." He silenced her with a single look, not cruel, but utterly implacable. He had decided she would be carried, and so she would be. There was no negotiation, no deference to her wishes. As he began walking, Elara became acutely aware of how her body pressed intimately against his naked chest. Heat bloomed across her cheeks, spreading lower still. She had never been held like this, not by her distant father, not by the courtiers who had danced with her at arm's length. Her heart thundered so loudly she was certain he must hear it, must feel it where her body pressed against his. What did he see when he looked at her with those impossible eyes? A meal deferred? A curiosity? The forest embraced them both in its winter silence. Predator and prey, savior and saved, bound together in a moment where all the rules of her former world had ceased to exist, leaving only this strange new reality, where danger and salvation wore the same face. Chapter 4. The cabin's warmth enveloped them as Elara limped inside with his support. His massive frame seemed to shrink the small space, his wild presence making the familiar suddenly strange. Unlike her, who had been raised with rigid notions of propriety, he seemed entirely comfortable in his skin, indifferent to his exposure. His gaze followed her every movement with predatory focus, missing nothing. Elara busied herself with finding herbs for her ankle, the silence stretching between them, broken only by wind whistling through the cabin's cracks. "You need clothes," she said finally, her voice higher than usual, unable to maintain the pretense of ignoring his nakedness any longer. "I can't have you catching your death after you saved me." She rummaged through her meager belongings, her hands trembling slightly as she produced her spare chemise and a woolen shawl. He stared at the offerings, head tilted. Not confusion, she realized, but assessment, as if clothing were a strange custom he found puzzling but was willing to humor. "Here," Elara demonstrated, holding the chemise against her own body, then gesturing toward him. "For wearing." She slipped the chemise over his head with trembling fingers, guiding his arms through the sleeves. He complied, but his eyes never left her face, watching her reaction with an intensity that made her flush. The garment, loose on her slender frame, stretched precariously across his broad chest and stopped well above his waist, leaving him still largely exposed. "Well," she said, cheeks burning at the sight. That won't do at all. He looked down at himself, plucking at the tight fabric with a curious finger. When he looked back up at her, his expression held something new, a glimmer of amusement at her discomfort, perhaps even enjoyment of it. Elara retrieved her cloak next, gathering her courage before approaching him again. Stand still, she instructed, surprised by the steadiness in her voice as she wrapped the cloak around his lower half and tied it at his waist. The makeshift skirt barely covered his thighs, but it was better than nothing. Still, the arrangement seemed to emphasize rather than diminish his physical presence, and a nervous laugh escaped Elara's throat before she could stop it, the absurdity and tension of the situation suddenly overwhelming. The man's head snapped toward her at the sound, eyes brightening with interest. Very amusing, she said, limping toward the hearth to put distance between them. Now let me see about a fire before we both freeze. He followed, crouching beside her with fluid grace as she reached for her tinderbox. She could feel his breath on her neck as he leaned closer still, their shoulders touching as he sniffed at the tinderbox with intensity. This, she explained, her voice betraying her awareness of him, makes fire. His eyes lit with genuine interest. Elara placed the box in his palm, intending to show him how it worked. Instead, he immediately pried it open, tipping the precious flint and steel onto the floor with a decisive sound. Darian, he exclaimed, pointing at the scattered contents, the sound more declaration than question. No, no, Elara said, gathering the pieces. Though I suppose that answers what to call you. She arranged kindling in the hearth, acutely aware of how close he sat, how his eyes missed nothing. Not the quickening of her pulse at her throat, not the flush that had spread from her cheeks down her neck, not the way she shifted unconsciously toward and away from him in equal measure. Fire is important, she said, speaking clearly as she struck the flint, desperate for distraction. Fire keeps us warm, like this, see? Sparks flew, catching the dried moss. Elara bent forward, blowing gently until tiny flames flickered to life. Darian's reaction was immediate. He inched forward, reaching toward the growing flames with the confidence of one who had known fire before. Careful! Elara caught his wrist, instinct overriding her wariness of touching him. It's hot. It will hurt you. Darian went utterly still, his attention shifting completely from the fire to the point where they connected. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his hand until their palms met, fingers aligning. His dwarfed hers, calloused where hers were smooth. Yet the connection felt dangerously right. His thumb brushed across her inner wrist, finding the rapid flutter of her pulse. Elara's breath caught at the intimate touch. She pulled away as if burned. Fire! She said, pointing to the dancing flames. This is fire. Darian leaned forward, eyes reflecting the golden light. And I'm Elara, she encouraged, putting more space between them. She pointed to herself, retreating to the safety of formal introduction. Elara. He watched her lips form the word, his gaze tracking the movement with an intensity that made her suddenly conscious of her mouth. And you, she continued, pointing to him. Darian. Instead of repeating his name, he reached out, his finger deliberately touching the tip of hers, then following her gesture to press against his own chest. Yes. Elara nodded. She tapped her own chest, keeping well back from him this time. Elara. Then pointed to him. Darian. His smile broadened. He pressed his palm to his chest, the movement drawing attention to the powerful muscles beneath the straining chemise. Darian, he said clearly, then reached forward to touch not her shoulder, but the hollow of her throat where her pulse leapt visibly beneath his fingertip. Elara, he said. She froze at the contact, unable to retreat, unwilling to show fear. Yes, she whispered. That's right. His expression shifted from satisfaction to something hungrier. In the firelight, he looked entirely a man, a dangerously handsome one, with strong features and eyes that held depths of intelligence she'd only begun to glimpse. As he leaned closer, his finger still resting lightly against her throat, the light caught something gleaming against his chest. "What's this?" Elara murmured, reaching toward it with genuine curiosity. Darian remained still, watching her fingers approach with the patience of a predator. She gently lifted the jewelry, a ring, and her breath hitched as recognition dawned. It bore the royal seal. Not just any royal seal, the very emblem that had adorned the marriage contract she'd fled, the symbol of King Sohan's house. How had this wild man come to possess such an item? Had he stolen it? Darian watched her face, registering her change in mood with keen perception. His hand covered hers where it held the ring, not restraining, but establishing connection. "Darian," she whispered, studying his features. "What's your story? Where did you come from?" He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. His hand still covered hers, warm and sure, the ring caught between their fingers. Chapter 5. The days grew shorter as winter deepened. Yet Elara found herself watching the tree line with a mixture of anticipation and wariness each morning. Darian came with increasing regularity, emerging from the forest with silent grace. She noticed a pattern forming. At first he had appeared mostly in wolf form, but now he chose his human shape more often, as if conscious of her reaction to him. Always he brought gifts, not merely food for sustenance, but things that showed observation. Winter berries from branches too high for her to reach, unusual stones with patterns that caught the light. In return, Elara created proper clothing for him, though the task involved standing closer than felt entirely safe, measuring his broad shoulders and the powerful muscles of his thighs. His body radiated heat that seemed to pull her forward like gravity. "Arms through first," she instructed one morning, holding up the shirt she'd spent evenings crafting. Darian complied, his expression not confused but calculating, as if indulging her strange human custom while finding it unnecessary. The shirt strained across his chest in a way that concealed nothing of the power beneath. By midday, he'd invariably shed the shirt, claiming his freedom with unmistakable relief. But the trousers he tolerated, only after Elara made it clear she would not continue their lessons without some concession to modesty. Their days fell into a rhythm fraught with unspoken currents. Mornings brought language lessons, simple words at first, objects they could touch, actions they could demonstrate. "Water," she said, holding up a cup. "Water," he repeated, the word flowing smoother each day. "Bread." "Bread," he echoed, reaching not for the loaf but for her wrist, his fingers encircling it with gentle pressure as he took the food from her hand. "You must ask first," she said, trying to maintain the structure of the lesson despite her racing heart. "Say, please." His eyes held hers as he formed the word, "please," with a deliberateness that transformed the simple request into something that felt far more intimate. His vocabulary grew with remarkable speed, though he spoke rarely, relying more on the physical language that seemed to come naturally to them both. On a clear day, when fresh snow had fallen, Darian arrived with unexpected companions. The wolf pack emerged from the trees behind him, arranging themselves in a loose semicircle at the edge of the clearing. While the wolf cub Elara had rescued, which she called Finn, often joined them, providing a welcome buffer when the intensity between them grew too charged, she had yet to see the whole pack again. "You've brought your family," she said softly. "Pack," he said simply, then looked at her with unmistakable meaning. The message in his eyes was clear. They were his, and so was she. Finn darted forward, reuniting with the smaller gray wolf Elara recognized as his mother. The female wolf nuzzled him, then looked toward Elara with what seemed like acknowledgement. Emboldened, Elara approached the gathered wolves slowly. "They cannot understand," Darian said, his speech improving daily. Not like Darien. They're just normal wolves, Elara realized aloud. You're different. Something flickered in his expression. Knowledge or memory, perhaps. But he simply nodded. Different, he agreed, though the way he said it held no confusion or question. His movements flowed with assured power, reminding her that beneath his attempt at human behavior lurked something wild and dangerous. He wasn't pretending to be a wolf in human form. He was both creatures at once, perfectly integrated. You were raised by them? She asked. He nodded, eyes tracking the playing wolves. Always pack, he said. As Winter's grip tightened, they spent more evenings by the fire, Elara reading aloud from her few books while Darien listened. His appearance remained wild, hair growing longer, beard thickening, until one evening Elara could stand it no more. Let me help you, she said, retrieving her small knife and a bowl of water. Sit. Darien settled before the fire, his posture relaxed yet alert, like a predator at rest. She knelt behind him, acutely aware of his stillness, not passive but watchful, allowing her approach to his vulnerable neck only through choice and trust. With careful movements, she began trimming his dark hair, her fingers sliding through the surprisingly soft strands. Unlike the rest of him, his hair felt civilized, almost silken. Keep still, she murmured, though the instruction was unnecessary. He remained motionless except for the steady rise and fall of his breathing. When she'd finished with his hair, she hesitated before moving to face him. This next part would require closer proximity, a level of intimacy that sent warning signals fluttering through her stomach. Drawing a steadying breath, she knelt before him. Now for this, she said, gesturing to his beard. Don't move. With one hand steadying his jaw, she worked carefully with the knife, revealing the strong lines of his face one stroke at a time. The heat of his skin burned against her palm, and his eyes never left hers. As the last of the beard fell away, Darien's features emerged with startling clarity. The high cheekbones, the strong jaw, the sensual curve of his lips. He was beautiful in a fierce, untamed way that dried her mouth and quickened her pulse. All done, Elara whispered, her voice betraying her. Darien raised a hand to his smooth face, exploring the change with deliberate fingers. His eyes darkened as he watched her watching him, something primal and knowing in his gaze. Then, with slow purpose, he reached for her hand and drew her fingers to his face. He guided her touch along the contours she had revealed, the sharp angle of his jaw, the hollow of his cheek, the unexpected softness of his lower lip. Her fingertips tingled where they met his skin, and she watched, mesmerized, as his eyes half closed at her touch. For a suspended moment, they remained frozen in this shared exploration, the firelight dancing across their faces. Elara couldn't remember when anyone had looked at her with such naked desire. Darien leaned forward, closing the distance between them until she could feel his breath mingling with her own. His head dipped lower, but instead of finding her lips as she half expected, half feared, he pressed his face to the curve where her neck met her shoulder. He breathed deeply, his nose tracing along her skin. One powerful hand curled around her waist. Elara remained still, her pulse hammering beneath his attention. His hair brushed her chin, his warmth enveloping her like a physical thing seeking entry. For several heartbeats she allowed the strange intimacy, a part of her responding to the ancient language his body spoke to hers. But when the softness of his mouth pressed higher, to the pulse point at her throat, awareness crashed through her. No, she gasped, pulling back. We can't. This isn't proper. Darien straightened, his head tilting slightly, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth, not mocking, but clearly amused by her protest. Proper, he repeated, the word seeming foreign on his tongue. His eyes never left hers as he reached for her wrist, encircling it again with gentle but firm fingers. "Darian," she warned, though her voice held little conviction. "I am a lady of—" He silenced her with a single finger pressed softly against her lips, the gesture so unexpected it stole her words. His expression held neither apology nor confusion. He had no concept of the boundaries she'd been raised with. With deliberate slowness, he turned her wrist upward and pressed his lips to the sensitive skin where her pulse beat visibly. A small sound escaped Elara's throat, halfway between protest and pleasure. Darian smiled against her skin, then raised his head, triumph clear in his eyes. He had proven his point without words. Her body spoke truths her lips denied. Mortified by her own response, Elara snatched her wrist back. "You mustn't," she began, her voice unsteady. To her shock, Darian laughed, a fully human sound, rich and deep. Not the awkward imitation of earlier days, but genuine amusement at her conflicted state. The laugh transformed him further, making him seem less wolf, more man, yet somehow more dangerous for it. With surprising gentleness, he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture both tender and possessive. He rose to his feet with fluid grace, towering over her in the small cabin. "Late," he said, the single word carrying more meaning than his limited vocabulary should allow. Elara nodded, grateful for the reprieve, yet strangely disappointed. "Yes," she whispered. "It's late. You should go." At the door, he paused, looking back at her with an expression that needed no words to translate, a promise to return, a certainty that what had begun between them would continue. Not a question, but an inevitability. After he disappeared into the darkness, Elara pressed trembling fingers to her wrist where his lips had touched, her skin still burning from the contact. 3 months ago, she had fled a king's palace in terror of what her wedding night might bring. Now, in a humble forest cabin, she found herself drawn to a man who was more wolf than courtier, one intent on claiming her willing surrender. And what terrified her most was not his determination, but how close she had already come to giving it. Chapter 6. 3 days had passed since Darian's lips had touched Elara's wrist. 3 days since the heat in his eyes had promised what was to come. And for 3 days he hadn't returned. The first morning without him, Elara had felt relieved, a reprieve to gather her composure. By evening, relief had given way to curiosity. By the second day, curiosity had transformed to worry. Now, as the third morning dawned, Elara paced her cabin, alternating between irritation and concern. "Why should I care where he's gone?" she muttered, aggressively stoking the fire. "He's a wild creature. He comes and goes as he pleases." Yet she found herself pausing at every sound, her eyes drawn repeatedly to the window. When had his daily visits become so essential? When had his absence become a physical ache? By midday, snow had begun falling heavily. Her food stores wouldn't last forever. With a decisive nod, Elara reached for her cloak. "If the wolf won't bring food, then I'll find it myself." She had watched Darian track prey, had observed his hunting techniques. She was no helpless noble girl anymore. 3 months in the forest had hardened her. Elara followed rabbit tracks in the fresh snow, moving silently as Darian had shown her, improvised snare in hand. The snap of a twig, not beneath her careful feet, but somewhere deeper in the forest, froze her in place. Men. She scrambled up a massive oak, pressing herself against the trunk as voices approached. 5 men in the king's colors emerged below, royal guards on patrol. Among them, she recognized the leader from her previous encounter. His arm splinted where Darian had broken it. Beside him walked an older man with a graying beard, a crossbow strapped to his back. "I'm telling you, Thorn," the leader insisted. "It wasn't a normal wolf. It was a demon. Twice the size of any wolf I've seen with eyes like burning gold." The gray-bearded man, Thorn, adjusted his crossbow strap without comment. "Listen to Marcus," one of the younger guards laughed, "still having nightmares about big bad wolves." "It broke my arm with one bite," Marcus snapped, "then transformed into a man before our eyes." The laughter died. The younger guards exchanged uneasy glances. "You hit your head when you fell," one suggested. "Believe what you want," Marcus muttered. "But old Thorn knows I'm not lying, don't you?" The older guard's eyes scanned the forest. "I've hunted in these woods for 40 years. There are things here older than the kingdom." "Well, wolf or no wolf, we need to find the girl," one said. "King Sohan grows more impatient by the day." "And more dangerous," another added quietly. "What do you think he'll do to her when we bring her back?" the youngest guard asked. Marcus shrugged. "Probably the same thing he did to his other queens." Ice slid down Elara's spine. She'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed by the king's own men turned fear to certainty. "Hush," Thorn said suddenly. "Hear that?" Elara realized her foot had slipped, causing a branch to crack beneath her weight. Thorn moved around the tree and spotted her. Their gazes locked before he called out, "Found something, boys." "Well, well," Marcus smiled unpleasantly. "Come down from there, princess." "I am no princess," Elara called down, clinging tighter. "She's right," Thorn said. "She is a queen, married to our king." Marcus snorted. "Not for long, at the rate he goes through wives." "Get down," another guard demanded, "or we'll cut the tree down with you in it." "I'll die before I return to him," she said, meaning every word. Marcus unsheathed his sword. "That can be arranged, though His Majesty prefers to do the killing himself." The younger guards laughed, but their mirth died as a bone-chilling howl pierced the forest silence. "No," Marcus whispered, his face draining of color. "Not again." The massive black wolf burst from the undergrowth like a shadow given form, launching into their midst with terrifying precision. He went for Marcus first, fangs closing on the arm that had already felt their power. The man's scream cut through the forest as bones shattered anew. Elara watched as Darian fought, not with blind rage, but with calculated strategy. 2 guards fled. A third lay moaning, leg mangled. Marcus had collapsed against a tree. Only Thorn remained standing, crossbow aimed at the wolf's heart. Darian turned to face him, hackles raised, growling. "So," Thorn said softly, "you survived after all." The wolf snarled, muscles bunching. Elara saw it then, a knife concealed in Thorn's other hand. "Look out!" she screamed. To her astonishment, Thorn lowered both weapons and placed the knife on the snow. "I spared you once, years ago," he said to the wolf. "I'll spare you again today, but the king won't be so merciful. He hunts you still." Elara began climbing down, desperate to reach Darian. Movement flashed. Marcus lurched forward, grabbing the discarded knife. "Darian!" Elara screamed. The wolf turned too late. Marcus drove the blade deep into Darian's flank. A terrible sound tore from Darian's throat as he whirled, jaws closing around Marcus's neck. Blood stained the snow as Marcus collapsed. Darian staggered, a strange green substance visible on the blade embedded in his side. "No!" Elara cried, dropping to the ground and running to him as his legs buckled beneath him. "What's happening?" she demanded, looking up at Thorn with tears freezing on her cheeks. "What was on that knife?" "Wolfsbane extract," Thorn answered grimly. "Poison fatal to shifters." "Shifters," Elara repeated. "Men who can turn into wolves, like him, like our first queen, his mother." Elara's mind reeled. His mother was the queen? Before Thorn could answer, Darian's form rippled. The transformation seemed agonized, fur receding, limbs elongating until the man lay before them, naked and vulnerable, the knife protruding from his human side. His eyes, dulled with pain but still golden, found hers. One hand reached weakly toward her face. "Please," Elara begged, turning to Thorn. "Is there a cure?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but his mother's people might." They carried Darian to her cabin, Thorn's cloak wrapped around his body. Blood dripped steadily from his wound as they walked. "The queen, Esther, came from the neighboring kingdom," Thorn explained. "She fell in love with King Sohan, who returned her affection, but she kept her wolf nature secret." "And then?" Elara asked. "She gave birth to a son with glowing golden eyes. The king accused her of witchcraft. In desperation, she revealed her true nature." Thorn continued once they'd settled Darian on the cot. The king was horrified, not just by the transformation, but by the legend that a shifter's bite is fatal to humans. His love turned to hatred, of her, of their child, of all shifters. So he planned to kill them both. He had poison created specifically to kill shifters. When the queen discovered his plan, she fled with the infant prince. "I was sent to hunt them down." "You." Elara's hand stilled. Thorn nodded. "I tracked them until I cornered them near a wolf den." "You killed her," Elara whispered. "She fought," Thorn said, his voice hollow with regret, "transformed to protect her child." "And the baby?" Elara demanded, her hand finding Darian's. "You left an infant to die?" Shame crossed the hunter's face. "Yes." "That was not right," Elara said, anger cutting through fear. "That was murder. I am a hunter. I do what I am contracted to do." She saw the guilt in his eyes and seized upon it. "Then I contract you now," she said firmly. "Go to his mother's people. Tell them the prince lives but needs help." Thorn shook his head. "I am the king's man who killed their queen. They'll tear me apart." "Or they'll listen when you bring news of her son," Elara countered. "You owe him this chance." Darian's breathing had grown labored, his skin burning with fever. The wound seeped blood mixed with greenish fluid. Thorn studied them both, the dying shifter prince and the desperate young queen willing to defy a king for him. "I'll try," he said finally. "Keep the blade in until help arrives. Removing it will only spread the poison. Keep him cool and make him drink water if he wakes." He moved toward the door. "If I don't return by tomorrow's nightfall, it will be because I can't." Elara nodded. "Go quickly." After Thorn departed, she bathed Darian's face with cool water. His eyes flickered open occasionally, focusing on her with confusion before pain dragged him back under. "Hold on," she whispered, pressing her lips to his burning forehead. "Please hold on." Chapter 7. Through the night, his condition had steadily worsened. The strange green discoloration spread outward from the wound, veining his side with unnatural color. His breathing grew more shallow with each passing hour. Thorn had not returned, and Elara's hope faded with the stars. If help was coming, it would have arrived by now. "I won't let you die," she whispered, smoothing sweat-dampened hair from his forehead. "I won't." She had studied healing texts secretly when her father deemed such knowledge unsuitable for a future queen. If Thorn couldn't bring help, she would create her own remedy. Elara stepped outside where movement caught her eye. Finn, the wolf cub she'd rescued, now nearly full-grown. "He's dying," Elara told the wolf. "I need to find herbs to help him." To her surprise, several more wolves materialized from the forest, forming a loose semicircle around her, Darian's pack. Without their alpha, they seemed uncertain, wary. Yet they hadn't fled. "I need winter root," she explained, "and blood moss, fever fern." Finn tilted his head, then turned toward the trees, looking back expectantly. "You'll help me," she whispered. The wolf started forward, pausing to ensure she followed. The rest of the pack flanked them as Elara hurried after Finn. He led her to places she would never have found alone, and by midday, her pouch bulged with healing plants. Elara worked feverishly, grinding herbs into poultices, brewing others into bitter teas. The knife remained in Darian's side, as Thorn had instructed, but she packed healing pastes around it. Hours passed with no change. Night fell, and still Elara worked, replacing poultices, bathing his fevered skin. The wolves remained outside, occasional howls breaking the silence. Near midnight, Darian's breathing faltered, then stopped altogether. Panic clawed at Elara's throat. "No!" she sobbed, pressing her hands to his chest. "Don't you dare leave me!" She struck his sternum with her fist. Once, twice, desperate to restart his heart. On the third blow, he gasped, a ragged intake of breath. His eyes flew open, golden and confused, before sliding shut again. But he breathed. He lived. By morning, his fever had broken. The green tendrils had receded, leaving only a faint discoloration around the wound. She'd done it. Against all odds, she'd saved him. After careful deliberation, Elara finally removed the knife, applying fresh poultice immediately to the bleeding puncture. As the immediate danger passed, Elara became acutely aware of other concerns. Darian lay mostly uncovered, only a thin sheet preserving his modesty. His powerful chest rose and fell with each breath, no longer labored, but deep and even. She needed to clean him again, to check the wound. Yet now, with death no longer hovering at her shoulder, she found herself suddenly shy, overly conscious of his nakedness beneath the sheet. With trembling hands, she dipped a cloth into clean water and began to bathe his face, his neck, his shoulders. She could no longer deny the way her pulse quickened when she touched him, the heat that pooled low in her belly when his skin met hers. She bit her lip, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. What future could they possibly have? Once he recovered, once he learned the truth about his heritage, would he even want her? She was so lost in these spiraling thoughts that she didn't notice his eyes had opened until his hand closed gently around her wrist. Elara. Her name on his lips startled her from her reverie. She looked down to find him watching her, those golden eyes clear and alert for the first time in days. "Darian," she whispered, throwing her arms around him, pressing her face against his neck. "You're awake. You're alive." His arms encircled her, one hand tangling in her hair, holding her against him with surprising strength. She felt his heart beating against her own, strong and steady. "You saved me," he said, his voice rough, but his words clearer than she'd ever heard them. The day passed in quiet care, Elara preparing broth, changing bandages. His recovery seemed almost miraculous. By evening, he could stand briefly, leaning heavily on her shoulder. As night fell, Elara knew she could no longer delay the inevitable conversation. "Darian," she began, kneeling beside him, "we need to leave. The king, your father, will send more men. We're not safe here." "Your mother was a queen," Elara continued urgently. "Your father is King Sohan, the same king I fled from, the same king who hunts us both." Understanding dawned in his eyes, pieces falling into place. His hand touched the royal crest that still hung around his neck. "Father, killed mother." "Yes," she whispered, "and he'll kill us too if we stay. We have to go now. Find your mother's people." But Darian wasn't listening to her words. His eyes had darkened, focusing on her face, her lips, with an intensity that made her words falter and die. "Darian," she tried again, her voice less certain. "Did you hear what I said? We need to—" He silenced her with a finger pressed gently to her lips, then replaced his finger with his lips. The kiss caught her completely off guard. It was tentative for only a heartbeat before deepening into something raw and demanding. His hand slid into her hair, drawing her closer. "Wait," she gasped when they finally parted. "We can't. You're still healing, and we need to leave, and this isn't—" He kissed her again, more insistently. His hands found the laces of her dress, tugging with gentle but unmistakable intent. "Need you," he murmured, the simple declaration sending a shiver down her spine. The urgency in his voice, the naked desire in his eyes, broke through her last defenses. 3 days she had watched him fight for his life, had thought him lost to her forever. Now he was alive, warm, real beneath her hands, and suddenly her carefully constructed arguments about propriety and timing seemed meaningless. "We're not married," she said weakly, even as she allowed him to ease the dress from her shoulders. Darian's laugh was low and knowing. His eyes, gleaming gold in the firelight, held no concern for human customs or courtly rules. When his lips found her throat, Elara's remaining resistance crumbled. Her hands moved of their own accord, exploring the contours of his chest, his shoulders. At the height of their passion, she finally admitted the truth she'd been denying for weeks. "I love you," she breathed against his skin. His answer was a growl of pure satisfaction, his arms tightening around her. No words. He needed none. His body, his eyes, his touch had already declared what he felt more clearly than any human language could express. Later, wrapped in blankets before the fire, Elara found herself drifting toward sleep. The danger hadn't disappeared. They would need to leave soon. But for this moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in the circle of Darian's arms. She was nearly asleep when a sound outside the cabin jarred her awake. The soft crunch of footsteps in snow, too deliberate to be animal. Darian tensed beneath her, his body instantly alert. "The king's guards," Elara whispered, fear flooding back. Darian rose from the bed, moving to the window. Through the icy pane, the moonlight revealed a sight that stole her breath. Surrounding the cabin stood dozens of massive wolves with gleaming eyes that reflected the moonlight like lanterns. Among them walked tall figures that seemed to shift between wolf and human form. And there, approaching the cabin door, was Thorn. Beside him walked a regal woman wrapped in furs, her eyes gleaming the same impossible gold as Darian's. Elara's hand found Darian's as understanding dawned. The shifters had come, not the king's men, but something far more ancient and powerful. "Your people," she whispered. "They found you." Epilogue. Elara stood waiting at the edge of a small clearing, her cloak pulled tight against the lingering morning chill. Behind her, Thorn conferred quietly with Lisa, Darian's aunt and the leader of the shifter clan who had come to claim their lost prince. "A hunting accident," Thorn was saying, his weathered voice carrying on the breeze. "The king's runaway bride, tragically lost in the forest. I'll bring back evidence enough to convince him." Lisa nodded, evaluating the old hunter who had once been her people's enemy. "And what will you gain from this deception, Hunter?" "A conscience somewhat clearer," Thorn answered simply. Elara turned away, giving them privacy for their planning. Her attention focused instead on the edge of the forest, where Darian, in his wolf form, stood surrounded by his pack. The massive black wolf moved among his family, touching noses with each in turn, exchanging what she now understood were complex communications through scent and subtle body language. These were not the shifters who had come to claim their lost prince. These were the ordinary wolves who had raised him, protected him, taught him to survive in a world that would have destroyed him. They could not follow where he was going. Their territory, their lives, remained here in the forest that had sheltered them all. The sight brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Another farewell. Another severance from the familiar. Lisa approached, standing beside Elara as they watched the wolves' goodbye ritual. "He considers you his mate," the older woman said without preamble. "You understand what this means among our kind?" Elara nodded, remembering the conversation from days earlier when the concept had been explained. Among shifters, mating was a bond formed through either fate or choice, and sealed through physical union. It was, in its way, both simpler and more profound than human marriage. "I understand," she said quietly. "But does he?" Lisa's lips curved in a rare smile. "He understood long before you did. The wolf in him recognized you as his mate from the moment you saved that cub." For him, it is not a question or a choice. It is simply fact, as certain as the moon's pull or the changing seasons. Lissa's expression softened slightly. And do you feel the same certainty? The question gave Elara pause, not because she doubted her feelings, but because she wanted to honor its importance with a thoughtful answer. In my world, marriages are arranged for advantage, not affection, she said finally. I ran from such a marriage into the forest, hoping only for freedom. I never expected to find love there instead. She looked at Darian, still moving among his wolf family. I'm nervous about the life ahead, but I've never been more certain of him. Lissa followed her gaze. He straddles two worlds, never fully wolf, never fully human. Now you will do the same. Yes, Elara agreed, but we'll do it together. The largest of the wolves, an aging female with silver threading her muzzle, approached Darian one final time. She pressed her head beneath his jaw in what Elara had learned was a gesture of submission and respect. The rest of the pack followed, acknowledging their alpha one last time before he departed their territory forever. Only Finn, the wolf cub Elara had rescued that fateful night, remained apart from the ritual. When the other wolves began to retreat into the forest, he stayed, watching Darian with evident confusion. Darian padded toward Elara, his massive form fluid with power and grace. As he reached her side, his form rippled and shifted, fur receding, limbs elongating until the man stood where the wolf had been. Lissa, accustomed to such transformations, didn't flinch, though Thorn still averted his eyes. They understand, Darian said simply, accepting the clothes Elara handed him. His words were few but carried weight. The wolves recognized he was embarking on a journey they couldn't follow. Will they be all right without you? Elara asked, watching the pack disappear into the shadowed forest. Darian nodded as he dressed. Strong pack, new alpha soon. His eyes followed her gaze to where the young wolf still lingered. But Finn comes. As if hearing his name, the young wolf trotted forward, coming to stand beside Elara. He nudged her hand with his muzzle, and she scratched behind his ears with familiar affection. He's chosen you, Darian explained, watching the interaction with evident approval. Young wolves sometimes leave, find new pack. Elara took a deep breath, looking once more at the kingdom she was leaving behind. Not just a place, but an identity. Noble woman, almost queen, dutiful daughter. Ready? Darian asked softly. Ahead lay uncertainty, a life among people whose ways were still strange to her, whose acceptance wasn't yet guaranteed. But Darian would be there, and Finn. Ready, she confirmed, squeezing his hand. Together, they turned away from the forest of their first meeting, following Lissa toward the lands where shifters had maintained their ancient ways for generations. Finn trotted at their heels, occasionally darting ahead to scout the path before returning to their sides. Elara didn't look back. The life behind her had been planned by others. The one ahead would be of her own choosing, wild and uncertain, yes, but freely chosen, and all the more precious for it. As they crested the hill, leaving King Sohan's realm behind, Darian's hand tightened around hers. They had found each other against impossible odds. A runaway bride and a wolf prince had built understanding in the spaces between words, in the language of presence and protection that transcended human speech. So no words were needed between them now to capture what existed, this thing both wild and tender, ancient and new. It lived in the brush of his fingers against her wrist, in the warmth of his body beside hers at night, in the silent promise of his eyes meeting hers across any distance. Whatever lay ahead, whatever new words they would learn, whatever challenges they would face, this wordless truth would remain, steady as the North Star guiding travelers home. Subscribe for more stories.